They called my father a pillar of the community. To me, he was the man who built his empire on my back, using my dreams as the blueprint for his lies. For years I ignored the gaslighting and the broken promises, desperate for the approval he only gave to strangers. But when he tried to frame me for his own financial crimes, he made a fatal mistake. He forgot that the architect who designs the house also knows exactly where all the structural weaknesses are. How do you expose a master manipulator who is also your own father? You don't get angry, you get organized. Listen to my full story to hear how I used his own scheme to tear his entire world down, brick by brick. If you enjoyed this video or found it helpful, go ahead and give it a like. It really helps me out. And if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button so you don't miss any future videos. Thanks a bunch! The first crack in the foundation appeared at my father's 25th wedding anniversary party. It wasn't a hairline fracture. It was a deep, resonant shudder that vibrated up from the polished Italian marble, through the soles of my shoes, and lodged itself permanently in my chest. The party was a monument to my father's ego, held at his and my stepmother Claire's new lakeside home outside of Austin. A home that I had designed. For 2 years I had poured every ounce of my talent and a significant portion of my own savings into that building. It was supposed to be my masterpiece, the project that would finally make my father, Richard, see me as more than just a convenient, in-house resource. He stood at the center of the grand room, a flute of champagne in one hand, his other arm wrapped possessively around Claire's waist. The setting sun bled through the floor-to-ceiling windows I had meticulously positioned to catch the golden hour light, casting him in a saintly glow. "I want to thank you all for coming," he began, his voice smooth and confident, the sound of old money and unshakable authority. "And I want to especially thank my son, Alex." He beamed at me, and 100 pairs of eyes followed his gaze. I felt a familiar, pathetic surge of warmth. This was it, the recognition. He poured his heart and soul into designing this house for us, a testament to his burgeoning talent. The room applauded politely. I felt my girlfriend, Sarah, squeeze my hand under the table. She knew what this meant to me. But then my father's smile tightened just a fraction. It was a micro-expression I knew all too well. It was the smile he used right before the axe fell. "Of course," he continued, with a magnanimous little chuckle, "he's still young. There are certain youthful eccentricities in the design. A few structural quirks that only a more seasoned eye would catch. That's why, as a learning opportunity for Alex, I've brought in the legendary Marcus Thorne to refine the project, to bring it up to my standards." The air was sucked out of my lungs. Marcus Thorne. He wasn't just seasoned, he was a titan, a man whose name was whispered with reverence. And my father was framing his presence here as a favor to me. He wasn't just replacing me. He was publicly demoting me from architect to apprentice on my own project, in front of everyone I knew. The room murmured with what they thought was a father's wise mentorship. I saw pity in some of their eyes. But I knew what it really was. It was a public execution, delivered with a smile. The gaslighting was so potent, so perfectly delivered, I could almost taste it, like ozone after a lightning strike. He was telling me, and the world, that my best work wasn't good enough, and that I should be grateful for the lesson. My childhood wasn't a war zone like you hear in some stories. It was more like a beautifully curated museum where I was a display piece that was perpetually out of place. My mother, Eleanor, was the quiet, gentle curator of our lives. She was an artist, a painter of soft landscapes that felt a million miles away from the sharp, unforgiving lines of my father's world. Richard was a real estate developer, even back then. He didn't just build houses, he built a narrative. The narrative of the perfect family, the successful man, the flawless life. Every Sunday we'd go to brunch at the country club, and I'd have to wear a blazer that was always too stiff in the shoulders. I had to learn to shake hands with his business partners before I even knew my multiplication tables. My grip, he'd tell me later in the car, was too weak, my eye contact too fleeting. Everything was a performance, and I was constantly failing my audition. He pushed me toward architecture. I had a knack for drawing, a trait from my mother, but he saw it not as art, but as a utility. "Architects are respected, Alex," he'd say, looking at me over his Wall Street Journal. "They build legacies. Painters. They decorate." It was the casual, brutal dismissal of my mother, and by extension, the part of me that was like her. But I was desperate for his approval, a bottomless well of need that he occasionally filled with a single precious drop of praise. So I became an architect. I was good at it, but the passion was never really mine. It was a costume I wore to please him. My mother tried to protect me. She'd create these little pockets of peace in our sterile designer home. In her art studio, a converted sunroom that smelled of turpentine and lavender, she'd let me be a kid. We'd listen to music, she'd tell me stories, and she'd let me draw whatever I wanted. Dragons, spaceships, things with no practical purpose at all. She was the only person who saw me, the real me, not the son of Richard projection. But I could see my father's world grinding her down. Her smiles became fainter, the colors in her paintings more muted. Their arguments were never loud, screaming matches. They were quiet, tense negotiations conducted in hushed tones behind closed doors, but the silence that followed was always heavier than any shout. She died when I was 17, a car accident on a rainy Tuesday night. My father said she lost control on a slick road. He was devastated, of course. He played the part of the grieving widower perfectly. He accepted casseroles from neighbors, with a stoic single tear rolling down his cheek. He gave a eulogy that was a masterpiece of public sorrow. But I knew they had been fighting that night. I had heard the low, serrated edge of his voice from my bedroom. I had heard the front door slam. I never accused him of anything, not directly. I couldn't. The thought was too monstrous. The cognitive dissonance nearly broke me in two. The man who was the pillar of our community, the grieving husband, and the man whose cold anger had followed my mother out the door on the last night of her life. He married Claire less than a year later. She was everything my mother wasn't: sharp, loud, metallic. She was a real estate agent who specialized in luxury properties, and their marriage felt more like a merger than a romance. She slotted into my mother's place so seamlessly it felt like a violation. She redecorated the house, replacing my mother's soft landscapes with abstract metal sculptures and black and white photography. My mother's art studio was turned into a home gym. Within months, it was like Eleanor had never existed. My father's exploitation of me began in earnest after that. It started small. "Alex, could you just whip up a quick rendering for the Henderson property? Their architect is dragging his feet. Alex, take a look at these blueprints. Tell me where we can cut costs." I did it, of course. I told myself I was helping the family business, that I was earning my keep. He never paid me for any of it, but he was always dangling a carrot. "Once you graduate, we'll make you a partner. Richard and Son Developments." Has a nice ring to it, doesn't it? The carrot just got bigger over time. He'd borrow money from me. When I got my first big commission after college, he needed $50,000 for a short-term cash flow issue on a new condo project. He promised to pay me back in 6 months, with interest. He never did. When I'd bring it up, he'd look at me with this wounded expression. "Alex, are we really going to nickel and dime each other? We're family. What's mine is yours, and what's yours is mine." The phrase was a trap. It only ever flowed in one direction. My helplessness was a learned response, conditioned over years of this psychological manipulation. To argue was to be ungrateful. To demand what was mine was to be selfish. The lakeside house was supposed to be different. It was his masterpiece, his legacy home, and he chose me to design it. "No one else, Alex," he'd said, putting a heavy hand on my shoulder. "Only you understand my vision." For the first time, I felt like I was being truly seen. I poured everything into it. I worked 80-hour weeks. I negotiated with contractors. When the budget for the custom Italian marble came in too high, I covered the $30,000 difference myself, telling him it was a gift. I saw it as an investment in my future, in our relationship. I was building a home for my father, but I was also building a bridge, hoping he would finally walk across it and meet me in the middle. Standing there at the party, with the laughter of the crowd echoing in my ears and the taste of humiliation coating my tongue, I finally understood. He hadn't asked me to build a bridge. He had asked me to build a stage on which he could perform his magnanimity while simultaneously demonstrating my inadequacy. Marcus Thorne wasn't there to refine my design. He was a prop, a living, breathing symbol of my failure. Later that night, after Sarah and I had made our excuses and left, I stood in my own, much smaller apartment, staring at the framed photo on my desk. It was of me and my mother, taken in her studio. I was maybe 10, grinning, with paint smudged on my cheek. She was looking at me, not the camera, with an expression of pure, unconditional love. and I felt a different kind of crack appear inside me, not one of failure, but one of resolve. My father had spent my entire life teaching me that I was inadequate, that I needed him. That night, I started to suspect the truth was the exact opposite. He was the one who needed me, and I was about to find out why. The architect knows every secret of the house he builds, every load-bearing wall, every hidden conduit, and every single weakness in the foundation. And I was done admiring the facade. I was going to start looking at the blueprints. The days after the party were a masterclass in gaslighting. My father called me, his voice dripping with paternal concern. "Alex, son, you left so early. Claire and I were worried. Are you all right? You seemed a bit sensitive last night." "Sensitive?" I repeated, the word catching in my throat. "You publicly humiliated me, Dad, on my own project." There was a sigh on the other end of the line, the weary sound of a patient man dealing with a hysterical child. "Oh, Alex. You're completely misinterpreting this. This is a good thing for you. Learning from a master like Marcus Thorne? That's an opportunity I would have killed for at your age. I'm trying to help your career, to build you up. I'm sorry if your ego is a little bruised, but sometimes a little constructive criticism is necessary for growth." The cognitive dissonance was a physical force, a pressure behind my eyes. Part of my brain, the part conditioned since childhood, was screaming at me to accept his version of reality, to apologize for being so sensitive and thank him for the opportunity. It was a familiar, comfortable pattern of self-abnegation, but the new crack in my resolve held firm. For the first time, I didn't back down. It wasn't constructive criticism, Dad. It was a power play, and I'm not okay with it. The silence that followed was cold. "Well," he said, his tone shifting from concerned father to disappointed CEO. "I'm sorry you feel that way. When you're ready to be a professional, you know where to find me." He hung up. That conversation was the starting gun. My father thought he was putting me in my place. In reality, he had just given me the one thing I needed most: distance. He expected me to sulk, to feel the sting of his disapproval, and then come crawling back, eager for his forgiveness. He didn't realize I wasn't looking for forgiveness anymore. I was looking for leverage. My revenge wasn't born from a single moment of rage, but from a slow, methodical excavation of 2 decades of quiet injustices. I was an architect. I live in a world of details, of stress tests and load calculations. I started applying that same obsessive precision to my father's life. I locked myself in my home office, turning it into a war room. I pulled up the digital files for every single project I had ever helped him with, from the quick renderings in college to the full-scale plans for the lakeside house. At first, I didn't know what I was looking for. I just had a feeling, a deep-seated suspicion that the cracks in his character must also exist in his business. The first clue came from the condo project he'd borrowed $50,000 for. I still had my original material specs. I had specified high-grade, reinforced steel rebar, standard for a building of that height. Out of curiosity, I did some digging. I found the public building permits and the final inspection reports. Then, through a contact at a construction supply company, I got a copy of the actual purchase orders for that site. They didn't match. My father's company had purchased a cheaper, lower-grade steel from a different supplier. They had used my legitimate, structurally sound blueprints to get the permits and loans approved, then swapped out the materials during construction, pocketing the difference. A difference that, I calculated, was well into the 6 figures. My $50,000 hadn't been for a cash flow issue. It had been seed money. A cold dread washed over me. This wasn't just shady, this was criminal. This was fraud. With a new, terrifying clarity, I went through every project, and I found it everywhere. The Henderson property, where I had specified solid oak flooring, had laminate installed. A small commercial center that was supposed to have a top-of-the-line HVAC system had a cheaper, less efficient model put in. A fact I confirmed by cross-referencing the unit serial number from a public photo with the manufacturer's database. It was a pattern. A sophisticated, systematic scheme. He used me, my talent, my license, my name, to create a facade of quality and legitimacy. He was building a house of cards on a foundation of my integrity, and he had been doing it for years. The lakeside house was the crown jewel of his deception. The scope of the fraud there was breathtaking. The Italian marble was real, yes, that was for show, for the guests to see, but behind the walls it was a different story. I pulled my late-night site inspection photos and compared them with the final invoices he had filed with his investors. The discrepancies were massive. He'd billed them for premium-grade copper plumbing, but I found receipts for cheaper PVC. He'd billed for high R-value insulation, but my photos showed the contractor installing the bare minimum grade. He was building a beautiful, rotting mansion, a perfect metaphor for the man himself. And then I found the real reason for Marcus Thorne. Digging through my father's company server, a password I still had from my time working on the house, I found emails between my father and his lawyers. They were discussing a potential audit from one of their primary investment groups. My father was getting nervous. He needed to create a new as-built set of architectural plans that would match the cheap materials he had actually used, burying my original, incriminating designs. But he couldn't ask me to do it. That would be asking me to knowingly participate in the fraud. So he brought in an outsider. Thorne wasn't there to fix my youthful mistakes. He was there to erase the evidence. And the plan, as laid out in the emails, was simple. If the fraud ever came to light, they would claim the young, inexperienced architect, Emma, had cut corners without their knowledge to save face. He wasn't just going to humiliate me. He was setting me up to be his scapegoat, his fall guy. The trauma bond I'd felt my entire life finally snapped. The son who craved his father's love died, and an architect with a blueprint for justice was born. I didn't sleep for a week. I compiled everything into a single devastating dossier. Original blueprints next to doctored invoices, material specs next to fraudulent purchase orders, my emails begging for my loan to be repaid next to bank statements showing his lavish spending. I created a timeline, a narrative of deceit so clear and undeniable that a child could understand it. I was building a case, not a home. And every piece of evidence was a brick in the wall of his prison. The final piece of my plan fell into place when I saw the announcement online. The Austin Heritage Foundation was hosting its annual Starlight Gala. And this year's guest of honor, receiving the Pillar of the Community Award, was Richard. It was his coronation, the peak of his public life. It was scheduled for a Friday night in 3 weeks. I didn't go to the police, not yet. A legal battle could be messy, drawn out. He could twist it, paint it as a bitter family squabble. My father's power lay in his public image. I needed to destroy that first. I contacted a journalist, a woman named Maria Flores, at the Austin Chronicle, known for her tenacious investigations into corporate malfeasance. I met her in a coffee shop far from my usual neighborhood. I didn't give her my name. I just gave her a flash drive. Everything you need is on here, I said. And the man it's about is being honored at the Starlight Gala in 3 weeks. The story should probably run on that Friday morning, for maximum impact. The morning of the gala, the story broke. It was the front page, above the fold headline, Pillar of the Community or Prince of Fraud. Developer Richard's empire built on lies, endangers public, sacrifices son. Maria had done a masterful job. She had laid out the evidence piece by piece, even getting anonymous quotes from disgruntled former employees, and a structural engineer who reviewed my data and called the lakeside house a catastrophic failure in waiting. My name was all over it, but I wasn't the villain. I was the source, the son who had been systematically exploited and set up to take the fall. The fallout was immediate and spectacular. By noon, his primary investment group had announced a full-scale forensic audit and a civil lawsuit. By 2 p.m., the district attorney's office had announced a criminal investigation. By 4 p.m., the Starlight Gala was canceled, the Heritage Foundation releasing a terse statement that they were re-evaluating their honoree. I spent that evening not at the gala, but at home with Sarah. We ordered pizza and opened a bottle of wine. My phone was buzzing with texts from my father, from Claire, from their lawyers. They were a mix of threats, pleas, and furious accusations. I didn't answer. I just looked at the picture of my mother. I finally understood the quiet strength in her eyes. It wasn't weakness, it was endurance. She had endured him. I had just refused to. In the months that followed, my father's world crumbled. He was arrested. The court cases, both civil and criminal, will drag on for years, but his reputation is gone forever. His assets are frozen, the lakeside house now a piece of evidence in a multi-million-dollar fraud case. He lost everything because he fundamentally misunderstood the person he had created. He thought he was raising a doormat. He had in fact trained an architect who understood, better than anyone, that a structure built on a corrupt foundation is destined to collapse. I've had to form new boundaries, not just with him but with the world. I'm learning to trust my own judgment, to value my own work without needing external validation. I sold my stake in my old firm and started a new one, a small boutique agency focused on sustainable, honest design. My first project is a community center in a low-income neighborhood, the kind of project my father would have sneered at. It's not a legacy, not in the way he would understand it, but it's real, it's solid, and it's mine. I no longer live in the shadow of the house my father built. I am finally laying a foundation of my own.